Well, welcome all to the Nashville Jewish Book Series. We are thrilled to have so many of you here tonight for our virtual conversation, a panel discussion about the book chosen. In the green room, or whatever you call it in Zoom, author Stephen Mills was telling us that there have been very few book series where they've addressed his book and the topic as a panel, and that was a good lead-in for us. It was important to us as a committee to have this conversation as a dynamic discussion of some difficult issues, and to connect the material that he talks about in the book chosen with the Nashville community. And so I'm Margaret Littman. I'm one of the co-chairs of the committee this year, and we were thrilled that one of our other committee members was willing to take leadership on this particular topic, because she is an expert on reporting on sexual assault, domestic and sexual violence. Natasha Senjanovic, she's an award-winning reporter, editor, and producer. This is her area of expertise, and she does it from a trauma-informed perspective. Her most recent work has appeared on local public radio stations. Many of you in the Nashville area have heard her on the local NPR stations, as well as on NPR Marketplace and other national programs. Throughout, Natasha's going to lead our conversation. We are going to put some links in the chat where we'll have links to buy the book. We'll also have some links to information that Natasha and the panelists bring up in the conversation. And then there'll be opportunity for you to ask questions, and you can use the chat box to do that. So Natasha, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. I thought you were going to introduce all of us. So I'm going to, first of all, let me show the book. This is the book that we're going to be discussing tonight with the author, Stephen Mills, who is also an activist, environmental activist, and an ambassador for Child USA. And I'm going to be asking you to talk about that a little bit later. And he's going to be discussing his memoir of child sex abuse. It is a difficult topic. We all know that, and are very grateful for those of you who are here today. We're very happy to have you here. Joining us in the discussion will be Lisa Milam, is how you pronounce your last name, right? Okay, I wanted to make sure. Who is a forensic social worker with Our Kids, which works with children in this region, basically doing forensic sexual assault exams and counseling and other services for children up to the age of 17. And Rabbi Shana Mackler, who is a well-known leader here in Nashville in the community. So I'm going to just jump right in, because we have, it seems like we have a lot of time, but there's so much that we could say about these subjects. I mean, a lot of time for those who think, an hour is maybe hard to sit through with this topic, but I promise that it will be engaging, it will be important. And also there are resources, there are local and national numbers here in the chat for anyone who is looking for resources for children, for parents, for adult survivors. And so, okay, I'll stop with the intros. And Stephen, could you give us a synopsis of your book, which is really your experience, right? Your personal experience, and what prompted you to write about it when you did?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks so much for having me. It's really an honor. And I love that you've pulled this panel together. When I was a kid, I was sure I was the only person on the planet who'd been sexually abused. I couldn't imagine this happening to another person. I didn't have any language for it, no framework for it. So I couldn't project out to this happening to another boy or girl. And of course, over the years, I came to realize that I wasn't alone. And over even more years, realized that, oh my God, this experience is actually pretty common. And today, of course, we know, depending on the stats you're using, but I'll go with 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys, which is the most commonly evidence-based numbers, is abused before age 18. Somewhat oddly, there are reasons for it, but we in the Jewish community tend to think this doesn't happen to Jewish kids, that this is like a problem for some other people over there in other communities. It's like a Catholic thing or a Boy Scout thing. This isn't a Jewish thing. Although, ironically enough, within the Jewish world, you speak to Orthodox Jews, they say that's a Reform problem. You speak to Reform Jews, they say, oh, that's an Orthodox problem. So this habit of othering is a real challenge. And the denial and the silence is really a problem because it leaves our kids in danger. If you're not really looking at the problem and talking about it and doing something about it, then we are just not equipped to protect kids. So 50 years after this happened to me, I decided to write the story. And, I tried to do a few things in the book, and I'll just lay those out quite briefly. The first part of the book is called Predation, and it was about my experience as a 13-year-old boy being sexually assaulted repeatedly over 2 years. And what I really set out to do there was to show the child's experience as opposed to our adult preconception of it, right? There's lots of books about that. But in fact, even words like sexual abuse, this is a very abstract adult term. To a kid, it has no meaning. I mean, so to me, this is 2 months after my bar mitzvah. I went off to summer camp for the 3rd time, and the director of this Jewish summer camp in Connecticut started acting as if he wanted to be my best friend in the world and proceeded to groom me for 2 months. And then a few months after that, got my mother's permission to take me away where he could sexually assault me in the woods, 100 miles from home. And that, for me, emotionally was an out-of-body experience, a near-death experience. And that's what I try to convey in the book, is that without language, without knowledge, the child experiences a break in reality. Everything I thought I knew and understood about the world, about adults, about my place in it, about safety and trust, all went poof, and it was replaced by something I can only describe as, horror or sci-fi. Here was this person who was supposedly my protector and someone I could trust above all else, and who in camp was like God. I mean, this was not a counselor. This was the director of camp. He is the king of the kingdom. So to have this person do this thing, which I had no language for, was, it sent me into shock. And I mean biological shock, where I couldn't think, I couldn't speak. And then I had to go to school on Monday morning. And so, part 1 is really what happens in trauma and its aftermath, how we're wired to survive, because I went about my life. I went through the motions of school. I went through the motions of family, of friends, but I was suddenly outside my life, not in it. And of course, today we call that dissociation. I don't use that word in the book because I don't use any jargon, but you'll get the feeling for what that feels like to be dissociated. Part 2 of the book, called Flight, kicks off when I'm in my early 20s and make the discovery that this camp director had moved on to another camp, another Jewish camp in Illinois, run by another respected Jewish social service agency, and was abusing boys there. And that realization triggered a lot of things in me. At age 23, I finally understood, like a lightning bolt, what had happened to me. Now I had language for it. Now I knew what he'd done. And now I couldn't deny that he was still doing it to other boys. And this is a very common experience of feeling you're the only one in the world this happened to. I mean, at least half the survivors I speak to have this feeling. Of course, a lot of that comes from the perpetrator, who is very carefully isolating the victim during grooming, physically and emotionally, psychologically, and then during the abuse is a horribly isolating experience. And so to realize what had happened to me and to know he was doing this to other kids, a couple things happened. One was I tried to confront him. I did confront him. This was 1978. And that didn't work. And I also confronted high-level employees at this camp. And this was my first encounter with enabling. I had no understanding of it at the time, but experientially, I realized that for some reason, almost all the employees in this camp and organization were protecting this person who was harming children. And I couldn't for the life of me understand it. They knew what he was doing with 95% certainty. And once I told them what he'd done to me, they knew it with 100% certainty. And yet they didn't do anything about it. And that, coming up against that, sent me into a terrible spiral. I didn't go to law enforcement. I was too terrified. I had a lot of shame, a lot of fear. I'd never been to therapy. I really hadn't. This was over a number of days, mind you. So it all sprang at me like a jack-in-the-box. And it sent me into this downward spiral of very self-destructive and really trying to erase myself. At that point in my early 20s, I was in a PhD program in economics. And my whole identity was wrapped up in being a successful student and really a very, very successful student. And here I was in grad school and on track to this professional career. And I dropped out and began shooting drugs, committing crimes, and trying to disappear myself. And it was all, I had no clue what was going on with me and what was driving this behavior. I couldn't make the connection between what happened to me as a kid, because this is how denial works. So that's part two. And I wanted to, my intention there was to show, I think for a lot of people, they think, oh, well, the kid's sexually abused, they get over it. And that's not how it works. Today we understand that a child can be sexually abused for 10 minutes and have the same symptoms of PTSD, dissociation, suicidal ideation, and panic attacks, et cetera, and physical illness, the same symptoms as a veteran, a combat veteran who's been under artillery bombardment for weeks, because the nervous system of the child interprets the attack of the predator in the same way. So this is important to convey, because when these things get laid down in the nervous system, the aftershocks go on for a lifetime. I'm in my 60s, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's a lifetime because while they've greatly lessened in me, it's still in my body. It's still in my nervous system now, 50 years later. So in part 3 of the book is when I finally find my way to therapy in my 30s. Again, this is pretty common, especially for male survivors, to try to numb the pain or kill ourselves. And the suicide rate is 10 times higher in survivors than in the general population. If we make it to our 30s, we reach out for help. And that is what happened with me. And I did get therapeutic help, which was a huge, huge breakthrough for me to be able to name what happened, to talk about it, to start reclaiming the story, the reality, to face it. Met the woman who would become my wife. I'd had many girlfriends. I had never disclosed any of this to them. And so she was the first person I had an intimate, honest, authentic relationship with, that is also a big deal for survivors who are lucky enough to get that kind of connection. All of that equipped me to make the decision that I was going to go to law enforcement at long last, because the perpetrator had moved on to yet another Jewish summer camp, this one in Pennsylvania. And I tracked down victims, former victims of his from my camping days and the camp in Illinois, and got statements from several victims, from several witnesses in different states, and took all that to the FBI because he had been trafficking us across state lines. In my case, from New York to Connecticut, which is a federal violation of federal law, not just state law. So I'm not going to tell you what happened at the FBI. You can read the book to find out. I need to leave you with a cliffhanger and end this part. But, you know, I'll just say that getting justice for victims is very, very painstaking and is a long, winding road. And I am still at it today. That was 1986. Here we are in 2023. I'm still trying to get justice, and I have a case in the courts in New York, trying to hold accountable the institutions in New York that were the first links in this chain of silence and complicity that stretched across all these respected Jewish social service agencies, you know, who protected this person. So I think that's tremendously important. Again, in order to protect kids today, because we can't face the past. How are we going to face something that happens this summer? You know, we need to learn how to face the reality and respond.
I think it's very striking. I mean, I could ask you 15 different questions right now. But to go back a little bit, I do want to talk about the grooming and maybe have Lisa come in at this point to explain. But I think what is most striking when you talk about just the levels of PTSD and how this remains with somebody for their entire life, the huge schism that we have, right, as a society between playing down, sort of downplaying what happens, and just how massive it is for someone that, you know, survivor, or, you know, children and even adults are not believed often, or if they are, we're like, well, that's just no big deal. That's, you know, we're kind of taught from early on that certain kinds of behavior are actually normal and okay. And if you come across them, and then maybe it's you who has instigated it actually as a child. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. One thing that I think at another panel you called serial predators con artists. And that term really stuck with me. It's something I've actually used for serial killers once before and hadn't thought about to use it in the same way, because, and you talk about in your book how your family was conned, not just you, not just the isolation. It's easy to understand how a 13-year-old boy, how a 13-year-old child, why they're so impressionable and how easy it is to manipulate them if somebody's really targeting them, right?
Yeah.
So Lisa, could you explain from your experience, and you have been with our kids, you've been doing this for over 2 decades, for I believe 25 years, right?
30 years.
30 years. 30 years. You know, what grooming looks like, because it's not just when you're talking about child sex abuse, you have to make it okay for the parents as well, right? You have to, if it is somebody outside the family, especially you have to con them as well. You have to get them to agree to allow their child to spend time with them.
Yeah, and I think con artist is certainly a reasonable way to characterize that. Having said that, I think it's even deeper than that, because when I think con artist, I think sort of like your used car salesman, that, you know, it's a pitch and it's sort of easily seen through. But for offenders, it is so much more woven into their moral fiber. It's who they are, and they don't see it as a con. I mean, they are genuinely convinced in their own mind that what they're doing is not only okay, but in some ways that, you know, the child, as you said, is an active participant. And it's such a, and that's what makes it such a sinister sort of act in many ways, is that you have a powerless kid here, and particularly for teenagers, because the sort of hallmark of teenagers is independence. And everything we're talking to kids about is about becoming independent, making good decisions, and owning or taking responsibility for behavior and all of those things. And so you have a teenager who's an unwitting ally in many ways because of the nature of their development. They don't see themselves as powerless, and yet they are. But in every other aspect of their life, we're saying you're not powerless. And it's what makes teenagers so vulnerable. All of that dynamic is what's so wonderful about teenager life, but it's also what makes you so vulnerable. And so you've got this person who's taking advantage of that, but it is so much a part of who they are that it's not even a con. It is who they are. And they're meeting deeply embedded needs in themselves they cannot meet anywhere else. And so, yeah, they believe every lie they tell, and which is what makes it so difficult to identify and to treat and to deal with. So it is certainly grooming and all of those things, but I can't stress enough that it's not like an offender thinks, okay, I'm going to do these 3 things to groom X child. It is just what comes naturally to them. It's like 2 + 2 is 4. And, I sort of, because I'm a sports, I played basketball my whole life. I mean, you put me anywhere near a basketball or a basketball court, there's no way I'm not playing before I'm done. I mean, I'm looking at it, I'm thinking about it. I mean, it's just a part of who I am, and I can't not do it. And what's so painful to know about offenders is you can no more talk them out of it than you could talk a non-offender into it, if that makes any sense. And I'm not saying that there's not help for offenders, because there is, but I can't stress enough, it is so deeply woven into their fiber that it's more than a con.
Yeah, I think maybe master manipulator, a better phrase, although I have a different, when I say con artist, I'm referring to a better sort of idea to think about as maybe like a cult leader. An alarming number of the most successful child predators are leaders, and they cloak themselves not only in an institution, but on being the greatest person that has ever come to your community. And so, and this goes, whether it's the Jewish, Catholic, Baptist, you name it. And I've looked at so many of them, and I know that Lisa has, and these are folks who it's so woven into who they are that they have manipulated an entire community of adults before they ever touch a child. So in my case, this person, Daniel Farinella, who is a social worker and revered he was the camping social worker of New York in the 1960s. I mean, he was at the top of his game and the top of the profession, and so admired that no one would ever call him into question. He was sexually abusing children and extended family members of board members of the institutions he worked for. So, how did he do that? Because he had already groomed every member of the board, every administrator, every employee. The entire community was convinced he was God's gift. And and when I say, and I hate to go back to con artists, but the piece about it that I just want to mention, because I think this is really what I mean by it, is that someone running a con knows what their mark craves most in the world. In this case, they know it intuitively. Daniel Farinella, his dark genius, and I say this toward the end of the book, was understanding how the Jewish community prioritized social justice. And he used that as a trap. That's how he gained the trust of people's children, was by touting his social justice credentials. What a mind blower that is, right? I mean, in the Jewish community, because that's our Achilles heel. how could anyone spouting social justice possibly be bad? People thought he was the second coming. And so that's what gave him the entree. And yes, that was all done so smoothly, so unconsciously, so, he had it all going on without having to think about it.
And the other thing is, for most offenders, sex offenders, 90% of what they do in and of itself isn't a crime, isn't wrong. I mean, spending time with kids, taking kids to camp, doing things for people, those behaviors that's the other thing, is this is a criminal enterprise where the majority of what you do to achieve your goal isn't criminal. It's actually normal caretaking and nurturing, except for the underpinning of sexual intent.
Right. And I did not want to equate sex offenders with car salesmen. I meant I think more along the lines of what Stephen is saying, of really there is a sequence of events that has to happen.
Yeah.
And like you said, Stephen, he on a social level, he used his social justice credentials. On an individual level, that was the Achilles heel. On an individual level, he looked for boys that needed father figures. He looked for boys that felt profoundly alone and came from families where there were holes for, all of us have them, right, to a greater or lesser degree. And something that is striking me, it's relatively new that we are talking about sexual assault and sex abuse as frequently as we are now, but we're still focused a lot more on girls, right? And so I think the next step really has to be talking about boys much more so, because, and you talk about how your parents were duped by him because your mother lionized Farinella, right? She really, for all the reasons that you just spelled out. Presumably, if a grown man had wanted to take her daughter, right, for weekend trips, for sleepover trips, she would have understood that. She would have maybe instinctively said, well, no, maybe I idolize this guy, but it would have been, there would have been an understanding. There's also a time when people weren't even talking much about homosexuality. And I don't want to equate pedophilia with homosexuality. That is not what I said, but it wasn't even in people's minds that men liked men. They didn't talk about it openly, much less that a man could like a boy. Again, I use that word very, that's not what I'm trying to say. But so I'd like to bring Rabbi Mackler into the conversation as well. Because so much is changing now, as a leader, from your perspective, what today, especially with Reform Judaism, right? Reform Progressive Judaism, what is being done now to preempt behaviors, to call them out, to put in structures that might help whistleblowing, and also to address the past, right? Because as Stephen said, these things are happening. They may have happened in the past. The damage and the consequences are ongoing, and very little justice has been meted out to anyone.
Yeah, thank you. That, I'm sitting here in awe and thinking about the idea of being a leader in a community, and the amount of respect and the amount of latitude and the amount of honor or trust that we're given just by the virtue of our title, whether it's camp director or rabbi or doctor or teacher, the amount that's given in the Jewish community, it's profound. We're welcomed in often in the most vulnerable of situations. And I think what makes for a very good rabbi is to be able to read people and to see what they want and how to help them find it through the traditions and community of our people. And then when that tips, when there's that sinister side of it, that same empathetic or intuitive, compassionate side can flip. And so I'm thinking about that power dynamic throughout the the reform movement, whether they're rabbis or youth directors, the reform movement has had a problem. And many of us grew up in that system, and we knew it. It was a very, the word that's been used is sexualized camping culture or sexualized youth experiences. Just the culture that was created around youth group and camp in many ways fostered a lot of the lightly termed misconduct, if not worse, that happened at camp, or during the youth groups. Not just, from, people in power to those who are vulnerable. So what the reform movement has recently done, and I know Stephen knows a lot about this, is, for the past 4 or 5 decades, the amount of silence and complicity and moving people around and not believing survivors and negating, stories or ignoring the truth has really come back to haunt them. And because I believe of the Me Too movement that sort of propelled this forward, and the strength of the survivors to come forward and name them in a public way, because many of them named them privately or named them in those institutions. And the institutions, whether or not they took it anywhere, those people were moved along, or they were allowed to get hired in different places without any acknowledgement that there had been an issue. The reform movement has, they did a serious deep dive into the past and called forward, for those complaints and that truth telling, and issued reports both on different kinds of abuse, and one particularly for children in the camping movements. I was the people that were named in there were my youth group people. They were there when I was there. The head of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, who resigned because of what we were told were extramarital affairs. It came out later that he had assaulted a 17-year-old girl. And that was during my time in rabbinical school. I will tell you that some of the work that's being done, the apology, the acknowledgement, it doesn't fix it. But I think that it's propelling forward as well. Some better training, some more reporting, the instance of belief, it's definitely not perfect. The ethics committee that we have as the reform movement for the rabbis is revamping how they do things, and what they, if there is a rabbi under suspicion or if there's a complaint against someone, they're doing the work that I think should have been done for decades already. And hopefully we won't have these, the moving around of folks, or even, it's not even the moving around from congregations. Sometimes the union itself for Reform Judaism hired these people. So if they were no longer allowed to be, not allowed, but they were not in the rabbinic positions or, in those camp director positions, they were hired by the union to oversee those programs. And I think the honesty with which they're trying to look at their that dark legacy, I think hopefully that will create the brighter place for people, that we won't have not only not the violations, but also not the cover-up that happened. Oh, yeah, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yes, the cover-ups are the enabling, right? Just when I think about it, for every predator, there can be dozens, if not hundreds, depending on the scale, depending on their reach, depending on who they are, of enablers. And in doing so.
So I was just thinking, everything that we do is about relationships. So, when it's built on relationships. So it's so easy to, to sort of discount what happens as, oh, you must have misunderstood, it may have been misread, and just to put it to the side. And like you said, with the way that your offender was believed and lauded in the community, the way that we know people in this world, is multifaceted, and we see them on the pulpit, or they're at our bedside, in the hospital, or they're presiding over the funeral and naming a baby. How could they possibly have done this? It's not the persona that they present forward, because the relationships that we have with so many people on so many levels, it will outweigh that. It has outweighed in the past that, that one comment, or that, that person's testimony. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I think that,
Yeah, and I think I would just add to that. I think that's so true. And what you point out about the power dynamic and the vulnerability in people's lives, and that can be turned on its head so diabolically. And I really recommend for those who are interested in that and getting deeper into that, Elena Stokman, who wrote an amazing book that came out last year called When Rabbis Abuse. And it's really a comprehensive look at how in the Jewish community, these roles can be, put to terrible use. I'm taking that power that you're talking about, which is of course there to help minister to people in time of need, but how it gets manipulated. And she literally goes through 30 different ways of how that power can be misused. And you just nailed one, which is minimizing, this response of oh, you misread that situation, always putting it back on the victim. But anyway, that is anytime there's power involved, there is the danger of misuse, for sure.
I will say the reform movement has done a lot recently. It's only, it's really just last year, 22, where this really broke and the investigation happened. But I do know, that the other movements are coming along with some of that. It's not quite as transparent in the process. I know the conservative movement has decided that if there is someone under suspicion, they're going to name them, and they're not going to hide the names from the list of people who are, under suspicion for any of the misconduct. And in the Orthodox world, through all the different branches of Orthodoxy, there's a lot of privacy that happens, and a lot of things that are done that are gender specific. And sometimes we don't, like you said, we don't necessarily assume that it'll happen, but there are women who are abusing girls in their schools, and people at the mikvah being abused, in these holy and ritual places that you would never imagine this kind of violation. We don't want to imagine that kind of violation happening in those sacred spaces. And so it's not just in the reform movement, but I know that I think that the steps that we're taking are good steps forward, and hopefully models for the other movements.
Yeah, and I do want to underscore that too. I think the roadmap that the Union of Reform Judaism released just 2 weeks ago, which was authored by two allies of mine, Drs. Gila Ben-Shmuel and Alyssa Ackerman, who are PhD criminologists and consider themselves survivor scholars. They really did an amazing piece of work, and that's a milestone report and a roadmap that the reform movement has laid out. And of course, the proof will be in the pudding, whether it's executed or not and implemented the way that Drs. Ben-Shmuel and Ackerman have recommended. And if it is, I think that's just really, really a great sign of hope for the future. And the conservative movement, I can tell, they just invited me yesterday to address a camps meeting workshop they're having in May, because, there's as a whole reckoning happening there, and just some terrible, terrible failures in conservative camps the last few summers. So, yeah, we're all, everyone is, because of, thankfully, pressure from survivors, now starting to reckon with this. And I do think the reform movement is leading the way.
Hey, I just wanted to direct Rabbi Mackler. She's got a question in the chat box.
Yeah, I was just going to say, So the question is everything being handled in-house when someone is accused of sexual assault or any other crime, or are police notified as well?
If it's a crime, the police are not, well, I should say this. If we have a crime that we are told about, particularly if it's involving a children, that is brought to the police. When it is an adult, there's sometimes they get to decide if they're going to bring the police into it. So the issues that we have, the misconduct that can happen is not just sexual, and so sometimes it is handled in-house, and then we get the ethics, if necessary, get the ethics committee involved. We have our own HR departments that help us navigate through some of that. One of the challenges, though, I think for a movement's sake, is that for rabbis in particular, and Hara Person, who is the head, said this, that that we, congregations hire, employ and fire rabbis, right? So that it's not the movement that does that. It's every individual congregation. So it is really up to every individual congregation to make that disclosure. So I would hold those other congregations accountable had they known something and didn't disclose it, moving forward when a rabbi had left. So I think there's a lot of accountability that needs to happen locally, as well as the ethics committee, with our movement itself. I hope
I
that.
do want to say that sorry, somebody joined us. If you could turn your mic off, Alice. Sorry. Underscoring all of this is the fact that, and this is something, and that I, as a journalist, if there's one thing that I would like to change mentalities on, is how little false reporting there is, right? Not many studies have been done, but what has been done show that false reporting of sexual assault is anywhere from like 0.1 to 7-8%. So, it's negligible compared to false denial. That's the real scourge, right? That's the real problem. So, and that's something, I think the first time I spoke to Lisa, one of the first things out of her mouth was, if a kid tells you that they've been abused, believe them, period. Like, that's the first thing you have to know is believe them. But also when we're talking about, in structures, and like you said, they shouldn't be happening. These things should not be happening in sacred spaces, but sacred spaces are also the most insulated. They are by definition the most private, right? Where the outside world should have not much influence, so that they can be sacred, right? And to a point, and we also know that it's, and we can tell people that they should be whistleblowers, but it's really, really hard to do that. It's so hard, and it's such an outlying thing that we have a special name for it. We have special laws for it. Right? Everyone else is sort of a team player. And, depending on how you're looking at it, they're a team player or an enabler. And those lines get very blurred very often in workplaces, right? In organizations, in official groups. So something I'd like, Lisa talked about in terms of solutions on the front end when you're hiring somebody. I know that when we talked about this a few weeks ago, you mentioned, you're not going to find necessarily people in criminal courts when you're vetting someone to hire them. So what are other ways that you can look for information to see if the previous workplace isn't giving you that information, or you've heard murmurings, or, where are places that you can look, hopefully, for some information?
Yeah, I think, and again, it's important to know that less than about 3% of all sexual abuse allegations or sexual abuse cases are ever prosecuted in a criminal court. It's just really rare. Having said that, there's another way that cases are managed. The Child Protective Services may make a finding that sexual abuse occurred. There's enough information here to substantiate this allegation. And when that happens, the person who committed that sexual assault or that crime or that behavior, their name is on a list with Child Protective Services, so that any agency that works with children in any way, shape, or form. If I go to work for, the camp that, Rabbi Mackler is in charge of, her people can do a check to put my name up against that list and say, hey, is Dr. Lisa Milam on your list? And that's appropriate. So that's the other way to begin to do that. In healthcare, there's actually also an abuse registry in healthcare as well. So there's different abuse registries at the state level, and the rules are different in every state, but they're generally the same and similar. So when you're working in a paid capacity, or even, I'm not sure if it's paid, you may be able to do it whether it's paid or not paid, but certainly a paid capacity, you can check those abuse registries, as well as the offender registries that only house criminally convicted offenders, which again is just not very many, frankly. I think the other thing you want to do, and I just at some point, and I would, I guess, shout out if he's comfortable to Stephen. And when I read your book, Stephen, there was something that I noticed. Offenders are very skilled at picking out the most vulnerable. They don't have to go up and do an interview. I don't think anybody probably goes up to Stephen and says, hey, tell me about your. Well, I mean, they may do that, but they've already identified him first. There's something about a child's behavior that sort of alerts someone, hey, this is a kid that I can target. And I think, teaching families and helping families begin to create safe spaces for kids and helping families learn to communicate, because so often it's right in front of them and they don't see it. And when somebody wants to spend more time with your kids than you do, that's clue one. But there's something about, families, and it's not an intentional ignorance or avoidance, but there is clearly something going on in the family that is creating that a higher level of vulnerability for a child. And I think as much as we can support families and recognize that it's important for parents to talk to their kids. If anybody touches your whatever body parts you call that, private parts, PPs, whatever, it's okay to come and tell me. Having those open conversations, and it is most effective when it comes from parents to kids. Let your kids know it's okay to come and tell you. And then when they do tell you, believe what they say. Just believe it. You can figure out the details later, but believe what they're telling you and then move forward from there. And in terms of the people hiring, when somebody comes to you with a complaint, like Rabbi Mackler said, when it involves children, we don't have to worry about whether I believe it or not. I mean, I would hate it if someone accused someone in my office, but I don't have to worry about whether I believe it. My job is to report it to the appropriate authorities so that they can investigate. And that's where your information is going to come from. I mean, what I believe is irrelevant. What's important is that I follow the rules and the policies of the organization. And that's another thing, having policies in place that your staff follow, whether it has to do with being alone with kids or, the amount of time that you spend with kids off site or whatever it is. What are your policies? And are people following those? Because if people are not following the rules, that's your first sign that you're in trouble in terms of people who cannot be respectful of boundaries. The sexual abuse can't happen in places where there's respect for boundaries and there's effective communication. It's that simple.
And where children, where survivors in general, and where children are believed, specifically, I mean, if you work in a place where if somebody's constantly rumored to have stolen from an association, from an organization they're working with, they don't get moved, they get fired, right? You don't say, well, okay, I mean, I don't want them to see, I mean, every once in a while it might happen, but for the most part, if someone is accused of fraud, you get rid of them from the organization. We recognize that as criminal, as fraudulent behavior. So, like you said, there have to be these rules in place, and underlying all of that is this belief, is understanding that this is criminal, understanding how often it happens, just how frequent it is. And I wanted to, there's a message here. I think there are many parents, caregivers that are still fearful of reporting and are also unsure about who to report to and how to move forward with help for the child and the person.
Yeah, and there is no place in the country that doesn't have a reporting system. Every state in the county or in the country has a child abuse reporting system. There's either a state hotline or a county hotline, but every county in this country has a child protective services unit that is responsible for investigating cases that happen in that county. And so, I mean, you literally can just Google child abuse reporting. There's a national child abuse reporting. I should have given you that. There's actually a national child abuse reporting hotline. And if you report there, they will funnel it to the appropriate state. But what you want to think about is in the moment is the county, where did it happen? That's where you report. I mean, the child may live in New York, but had been visiting in, Philadelphia. It's going to have to be reported in Philadelphia. You can report in New York all day long, but it's got to get to Philadelphia. So wherever it happened, as best you know, as best you can figure, that's where you make the report. If you can't figure that out, do it to where the child lives. Whatever place the child lives, make the report there.
And I think that really, that would be a wonderful segue to the third part of your book, because just jurisdiction is something that you came up against, Stephen, when you're in trying to this case. And if we have time, I mean, if you'd like to, I want to keep us to within an hour. If you'd like to keep speaking longer, by all means, I'm here. I'm happy to continue. But before,
and in the book, I do want to add, when I was reading, Stephen, I saw that, and it's both real and it's not okay, but it's also very real that the police officer here where I live in Robertson County can do nothing about something that happened. It doesn't matter how bad, they can do nothing. But it is maddening, and it makes cases so much more difficult.
Yeah, well, and we've got these, state-based statutes of limitations that are varied across the whole country, and there's absolutely no reason for there to be statutes of limitations for sexual violence against children. None. I mean, these laws just grew up by default because they were classified as certain kinds of felonies, and that's why there are statutes. But there's no statutes for murder. There's no statute of limitation for murder in any state. And there shouldn't be for the simple reason that these cases can get solved 40, 50 years later. It happens all the time. And the same is true with sex crimes against children. You look at my case, I've got a witness list that's several pages long. We've got the perpetrator on audio tape saying what he did. How is it that, this case can't be brought to justice? Well, now it can be in New York. Tennessee's had a much tougher time, reforming the statutes of limitations.
Yeah.
You need to go state by state, which is really horribly unjust for survivors. Yeah. There really should be a federal law, a look back period that lets, victims bring cases, as far as I'm concerned, as long as they're breathing. But yes, this is a big, big problem with localized, not just law enforcement, but getting civil justice in these cases. But it's changing. A lot of states over the past 5 years, I mean, Child USA has been been the moving force in this, designing these reform of statutes of limitations and advocating in state houses across the country. And, I think this year alone, we're probably going to get statutes reform in 3 to 5 more states. So, public awareness is changing. The average age of disclosure for a survivor is 52. That is starting to stink in at state houses, that, victims keep this secret for decades and decades and should not be penalized when they decide to break that silence and speak out. And again, this is in the interests of kids today and this summer camp, because the only people who benefit from statutes of limitations are predators. That they know that they're not going to get, prosecuted, and their employees know they're not going to get held accountable in civil court. So it's tremendously important to have a justice system that works, so that perpetrators aren't hiding behind that.
Yeah, I did want to say, I'm sorry, I forgot in the beginning that if anyone has questions, if there are other questions, please put them in the chat. And since Stephen, I mean, you're doing, but both of you done my work, you're all doing my work for me in the sense of the segues and can you talk a little bit about, so Child USA really fights for the human and civil rights of children. And there's something called the gold standard that they created. Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Sure. So The gold standard is a set of recommendations from Child USA that came out in 2021 that was based on a very in-depth study of thousands of cases of sexual abuse. So in other words, they went to the evidence, they interviewed survivors, they went through all the data of church cases, Boy Scout cases, the gymnast cases, and actually found out, why did this system fail? Because believe it or not, there were actually safeguards in place, including in the Boy Scouts and in many of these institutions. Clearly, they didn't work. Why not? And so based on interviews with the victims, they established why they failed and what would need to be done to put in place viable and enforceable safeguards for kids. So that's what the gold standard is. And so it's a set of not just background screening, but training procedures, codes of conduct for institutions, red flag behavior, reporting, what to do when, investigating, reporting to authorities. And the key to the whole thing is using insurance companies as the lever to enforce it, which I think is actually pretty brilliant, because it's the insurance companies that get caught holding the bag. And many, people don't realize this. Many youth serving organizations don't even have sex abuse coverage from their insurer anymore, because insurers don't want to cover it. And this is a huge gaping hole in many camps and institutions. So Child USA is now working with some pioneering insurers to essentially say to youth serving organizations, look, we're not going to underwrite you unless you meet a certain standard, and we're going to audit you every year to be sure that you're still meeting it. And that's sort of, the independent accountability, because without that, it's just so easy for organizations to fall back into default mode, which unfortunately is silence and denial and trying to make the problem go away instead of confronting it. And so I've seen this over and over again, not just in my case, but in the cases of so many survivors and institutions, where someone comes forward and the institution will, essentially circle the wagons and put out some window dressing, feigning good faith intent to get to the bottom of it and do something. And, surprise, surprise, nothing happens in the end. And, or commonly, it's past the trash. They will just move the offender on to another institution, often with a reference, sometimes not, but this, still leaving kids in danger. So having enforceable safeguards, hugely, hugely important.
Yeah. And there's a question here. Again, I have like 15 questions about everything that has been said. There's a question from Margaret here, who, if you're ready to switch gears, Stephen asks, she has a question about the journalism and the book writing decisions rather than the reporting. Can you tell us about the decision process of naming Farinel's family, his wife and son, in the book? And as a journalist myself, I'm very curious. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall of the, I'm sure, extensive legal review. But
very extensive legal review.
Yeah.
And, I named the family name Farinella. I did not name the wife and son by first name. And I changed their names. I changed the names of many other people in the book who were essentially bystanders. The bottom line of that decision, two things. One is he is already named in 2 court cases in New York, one of which I'm involved in. It would be disingenuous to name him in a public court proceeding and change his name in the book. It just wouldn't make sense. And the second thing is, I really believe that it is tremendously harmful to perpetuate the secrecy around predators. This is someone who was shielded, intentionally or complicitly by many, multiple respected Jewish institutions, and that's not okay. And it's one thing to fail, it's another thing to refuse to face that failure and try to do better going forward. That's all we can ask, right? You can't do that if you're not looking at, well, who was this person? Who exactly was this employee? And how did this happen? And alerting the thousands of families who were exposed to this person. So when I post something on social media, the camp I went to, the camp in Illinois, I hear back from other victims who only know because of the book and because I named him. That's tremendously important to survivors to know, to read this and say, oh my God, I wasn't the only one. And this is who he was. And so many other campers who knew something was really amiss. I hear this all the time. We have a kind of collective fairy tale around camps. And many people, for good reason, very attached, very nostalgic. These are some of the most wonderful paradise-like days of their childhood. And that tends to, block off the darker side and make it really hard for people to look at that. And yet there were a lot of people in camps, and not just the victims, but friends of the victims who knew and tell me 30, 40, 50 years later, I've been carrying this my whole life. I wasn't abused, but I knew my friends were being abused. I didn't have language for it then. I knew something was going on. Well, the ripple effects of this spread out through all of these Jewish communities: New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Illinois, Pennsylvania, West Virginia. There are thousands of people who are impacted by this person. I felt he had to be named.
To one of the points you just made, of so many people who knew, and whether they were bystanders, friends of victims, survivors, or the survivors themselves, carry so much shame.
Yeah.
I've talked to so many people. It's not just the survivors, it's the friends and the family members. And I come back very often to a line in an article written about the Me Too movement by in the Washington Post, calling, I'm tired of confessing to someone else's crime. And I think that your book goes a long way towards flipping that script of really undoing how much victims and survivors of sexual assault live with shame that doesn't belong to them.
Yeah.
Right.
Amen.
That is not theirs it was not yours to carry.
Right.
It should never have been yours to carry. And I will say, oh, okay. Yeah, Lisa has to go very shortly. I did want to say one thing when you were talking about like having healthy conversations with kids. One thing that I come across very often in talking to, and not just professionally through my work, but I almost don't know a single woman who has not had some kind of experience that is actual sexual assault or borders on sexual assault. And a fair number of men. And something that comes up often is as kids, girls in particular are taught this, but boys absorb it too. This education that we have of like, all men are pigs, all boys only want one thing, all men only want one thing, where we have established that being predatory for men, especially that being predatory, is somehow normal, is somehow that's just the natural order of things, that it cannot be controlled. And there's so many survivors that I've spoken with who said, I had no idea, like something bad happened to me. They think they instigated it for that very reason, because they just assume, well, all men have this very, very short sexual fuse. And this is not to downplay that, that women and girls also abuse, but we do know statistically that the vast majority of abusers are male. So I would also urge that those conversations to move away from those conversations with kids, to have healthy conversations, and to say that, it is not. Boys will be boys is another one, and males will be males is another, trope that has to be put to rest.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure, yeah, speaking about conversations for kids, this should begin at home, but also should be something that is taught in schools. Yes, unfortunately, in Tennessee, that's not a very easy, sex ed is not. That's a whole other panel discussion, or
Yeah, but this is definitely something that parents can do and should do, starting with when kids are very small. I mean, we teach kids 1,000 times to stop at the corner and look both ways, and teaching them about their own bodies really should be the same thing. It's not a big deal. And so, many parents say if you start young and do it repetitively, it's just part of the program, and it becomes normalized, that, this is your body and no one has the right to touch you, without your permission. And that sense of being embodied and having agency over the body is such a crucial, part of this. And, yeah. And, on that note, I think I'll drop in the chat a very helpful, guide from Darkness to Light, which is a national child sex abuse prevention group, which has trained thousands of facilitators across the country on, just for parents, about questions to ask camps, which I think is just very useful and practical, because we need to be asking camps, as discussed before, what their policies are, and to not hesitate to do that.
Well, I want to thank everyone very much. I know that Lisa has to go. If there are there any other questions? I have a million of them. I could. Thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us.
That was an honor. Thank you.
We really appreciate it. Thank you, Lisa. I know that you have family stuff. If you have to, I'm just going to wrap up and talk about some of our just upcoming events. But thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you, Rabbi Mackler.
Thank y'all. It was nice to meet everybody.
Thank you.
Nice to see you again, Rabbi Mackler.
And to shift gears completely, on the 23rd, we will have another virtual event. I'll actually be moderating. I think everybody's gone. Well, I should have done that. Oh, no, there are plenty of people. Sorry, my screen just went to a one-person view. A cookbook by Jasmine Benedetta Guetta about how Jewish cuisine has influenced Italian cooking. That was another one that I immediately signed up for, having lived in Italy for a long time. And
she's fantastic. I sat next to her today at an author event.
Oh, okay. I'm glad to hear that. We'll be talking next week. There's a link that Margaret put in to buy the book, which is chosen. And thank you again so much for joining us, Stephen, and for this book. And I know it was not an easy process none of it was an easy process to get you where you could even start talking about this, much less to write a book on it. And I know that you're a tireless advocate. So thank you for all your work.
You're welcome. And thanks for having me very much.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.